I want to talk about a new phenomenon we're seeing, which is the emergence of the Jewish center, the new emerging Jewish center. And I think we're all pretty familiar with the Jewish left, whether we're talking about the classical Marxist left or the postmodern cultural Marxist left. Most of you are familiar with the Jewish involvement in those things and the disproportionate Jewish representation in those things. And then there's a Jewish right, too, which I guess when you started having a populist right-wing backlash to that in the 70s and 80s, a lot of Trotskyist Jews suddenly became conservatives, and these neoconservatives, they successfully talked their way into conservative circles and conservative movements and conservative institutions, and made their own in some cases, and created this neoconservatism, which is basically all about supporting Israel and having a bellicose American foreign policy that doesn't benefit America but serves, Israel's geopolitical interests. So you have a Jewish right, or you have a Jewish left. You have a Jewish right that's kind of co-opted and redirected a lot of right-wing sentiments. And now you have a Jewish center that's emerging. Neither right nor left, but still decidedly Jewish. And this is represented by people like Steven Pinker, who's kind of gotten in trouble lately for, questioning some of the dogmas, the progressive left-wing dogmas and orthodoxies that prevail today. He's kind of got in a little bit of hot water for poking at those in some of his books and talks and presentations and everything. And also for looking at the alt-right in kind of a little bit of a more objective and critical way than some of these other people are doing. Not being just shrill and dismissive, but actually saying, oh, look, there's something going on here. And trying to put it in context and explain it in a way that's a little bit more subtle. Still wrong, but a little bit more subtle and, serious than everybody else is doing. And Steven Pinker is one of these characters. Jonathan Haidt's one of these characters. This is a moral psychologist who says he used to be a liberal or a leftist, or I don't know exactly what words he used, but he used to be on the left somewhat, and he says now he calls himself a centrist. He specifically calls himself a centrist by name because, according to him, he realizes conservatives weren't totally wrong about everything. But his real motivations are probably a little subtler and shadier than that, because there's an article he wrote for the American Interest back in 2016 where he talks about the authoritarian personality and nationalism versus globalism, and nationalism and authoritarianism being a reaction to normative threat from outgroups and stuff, and maybe a natural reaction or an unavoidable reaction. And so he talks about that reaction without vilifying authoritarians or nationalists, but just in a very academic way, and seemingly kind of sympathetic way. Not totally, but at the end of the article he gets to, the point, the rub, which is a set of policy prescriptions for globalists, right? How to do globalism, mass immigration and all this, without triggering this authoritarian nationalist reaction. And he advises globalists to keep it subtle, don't do too much immigration or pay attention to how much, moral difference there is between immigrant groups and native populations, and, make sure there's some progress towards assimilation being made. And all of these things, Jonathan Haidt says, will allow them to do more globalism and get away with it than if they just simply ignore this or vilify the reaction and attempt to paint it as pathological when it's really just a natural reaction to a provocation of these traitorous globalists, these treacherous globalists, these backstabbing globalists, trying to displace us in our own lands and dispossess us and disenfranchise us and disinherit us and all this kind of stuff. They're attempting to do tremendous damage to us with these globalist programs and these globalist policies for their own benefit, and that's why there's a reaction to it. So, his advice is not to stop doing that, but to just maybe tone it down a little bit so that we don't notice what they're up to, or that it's not at a threshold where our retaliation will be severe enough to do anything meaningful about it. So his sympathies are obviously still with the globalists. His loyalties are obviously still with the globalists. He's maybe just figured out that, they're doing a little too much, or trying to take a little too much, or impose a little too much to get away with it, and that if they want to get away with it, they got to tone it down a little bit. And that's the only reason that Jonathan Haidt has moved to the center. And I think it's the only reason most of these guys have moved to the center. And there are other characters involved with this Jewish center, this emerging Jewish center. You've got Dave Rubin, and Dave Rubin is a former shitlib from the Young Turks, total shitlib, and now he's LARPing as a libertarian, individualist, classical liberal, his show, his interview show is like a platform for all the rest of these guys, and he has all of them on, and Ben Shapiro and everyone else. And so he's like a mouthpiece for all these other guys. But basically at bottom he's a degenerate libertarian homosexual Jew. That's all he is. And if he's moved to the right or to the center or whatever they call it, then it's only because the last thing he was on, which was the Young Turks, which is total shitlibbery, wasn't working out. And even somebody as degenerate as Dave Rubin can see the writing on the wall. Like, where's that going to go? Like, people just aren't going to take it beyond a certain point. So you need something new, and there's going to be a reaction, and they can position themselves as, part of that reaction, or even maybe the head of it. And so he's just an opportunist. He sees the writing on the wall. He sees which way the wind is blowing, and he's going to get a little bit ahead of it, for self-aggrandizement purposes. And also, now he's in a position to kind of lead it a little bit, maybe. Kind of with this group, I definitely include Jordan Peterson. As far as I know, Jordan Peterson is not actually a Jew, but he might as well be. I mean, he's a Jew in all but name. And, the reason I say that is he spends a lot of time justifying and excusing Jewish overrepresentation in media and academia and science and narratives and news and everything else. He spends a lot of time justifying and excusing Jewish overrepresentation in these fields and explaining away the pernicious uses to which they put their disproportionate influence. Saying that, leftism is just associated with openness, which is associated with high IQ and stuff like that. So, a big part of his shtick is just justifying Jewish overrepresentation and Jewish disproportionate influence, and shielding them from question or criticism or retaliation. And in the meantime, he's also attacking white ethnocentrism, or white in-group loyalty, or white in-group identity. He's attacking all of that for whites, but not for Jews, specifically not for Jews. He's definitely not, targeting Jewish nations and ethnicities for destruction in the same way that he's targeting white nations and white ethnicities for destruction by attempting to pathologize the very idea of white people having nations or having ethnicities or having identities or loyalties based on those. Those criticisms that he makes for white people doing that, he specifically does not make for Jews. And he does everything in his power to defend Jews and excuse Jews and to shield Jews from criticism or examination or anything like that. All while he's criticizing whites for doing, far less than Jews do in terms of like ethnocentrism or in-group loyalty or in-group identity. Whites do far less of that than Jews do, but all of his criticisms are directed at whites, and he wants to attenuate those and disrupt those for whites, but not for Jews. For Jews, he wants to shield them and protect them from criticism, and muddy the waters and obfuscate matters, and just in a very Jewy way. Like, his rhetoric is very Jewy. It's very duplicitous and hypocritical and double-standarded. And this is why I say that Jordan Peterson is a Jew in all but name, right? Because as far as I know, he's not Jewish, but all of his rhetoric and everything is totally revolving around defending Jews and attacking and undermining whites. And, he does it in a very, kind of underhanded and duplicitous and two-faced, hypocritical way. So, and he's also friends with all of these other guys, with Dave Rubin and Jonathan Haidt, and probably Steven Pinker, I don't know how many of them, but, this is a whole little clique that kind of runs together, and Jordan Peterson is like the nominal, token non-Jew in this crew, apparently. He's the Shabbos Goyim of this group, assuming he even is Goyish. But then, going along with this, you also have Ezra Levant with Rebel Media, and, Mark Levine in the U.S., that's in Canada. Rebel Media is in Canada, and then you have Mark Levine in the U.S. with Conservative Review and CRTV and all this kind of stuff. And these are new, supposedly right-wing media outlets. And they are kind of right, maybe they're part of this whole center thing. But I hope I don't have to explain how names like Levant and Levine, what the ethnic origin of those names are. I hope you understand that already. And again, you have this whole, bandwagon thing. They can see which way the wind is blowing. They can see which way the, the tides are turning. And this looks like just an attempt to kind of get out in front of it and try to co-opt it or blunt it or redirect it, or, have a part of it for their own, or have some of their own be a part of it. And these organizations, Rebel Media and CRTV, they have their little stables of Shabbos Goyim, their Lauren Southerns and their Steven Crowders and these kind of right-wing, center-right, centrist, classical liberal people. And the whole point of these people is to air some of the legitimate criticisms of the left-wing degenerate status quo, and to air some of the legitimate criticisms, but to blunt the rest of them by saying, there's some criticisms that are just beyond the pale. There's some limits you just can't cross when you question this. So they're out there to provide a little bit of criticism, just enough criticism to kind of take the edge off. And maybe in the case of some of these guys like Jonathan Haidt, where he actually wants that criticism to be effective, and he actually wants progressives to tone it down a little bit, if only so that they can succeed more, right? Because if they overdo it, then they can't succeed. If they overdo it, there's going to be too much of a reaction. It's going to be too much provocation. They're not going to be able to get as much of what they want. Versus if they tone it down a little bit, they might get it slower, but at least they'll get it. And so, some combination of motivations like these is driving this whole Jewish center phenomenon, this emerging Jewish center that kind of revolves around guys like Jonathan Haidt and Steven Pinker and Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson, and then, outlets like Rebel Media and Conservative Review. And, we've had a Jewish left forever. That's nothing new. We've had a Jewish right for decades. That's not really anything new. It's still just as pernicious. Neoconservatives are absolute cancer. They're the worst conservatives by every possible metric. But now we have a very definite and very identifiable Jewish center as well.